Hello and welcome back to another Maya tutorial. In this video we're going to have a look at the very basics of getting started with Maya 2016. So this tutorial is aimed at beginners or anyone who's new to Maya or very new to 3D. To start with, we need to set up a project folder that so everything from our reference images to our textures all go in one place. And then we can move that project folder around from our home to our workplace, college or university without losing any important links or information. So in this case, I have a folder set up on my desktop. Make sure it's got an appropriate name. In Maya, go to File, Set Project, and then navigate to your project folder. Click on it just once, don't double click inside it. Set, and then create default workspace. And if we have a look inside the project folder now, you have this workspace.mel file. That's Maya's working file, so it's important not to move that, not to rename it or delete it. What we need to do now is create a subfolder, and we're going to call that source images. And it's important that is lowercase, so no capital letters, no spaces, underscores or full stops, and Maya will actually find that, it will look for that folder later on if we put any textures in or any reference images. But it's good practice to do that now, even if you know you're not going to use it, or even if you're just going to experiment and you're not going to create textures. Next thing to do inside Maya is save this scene before we even start. File, save scene. It will find the project folder because it's already set up. Give this a name. I'll call this scene 1 and then save as, and that will actually appear in our project folder. Now, if you're working on shared computers, you'll have to actually go back to File and then Set Project every time you open your scene, because Maya will only remember the last project folder that was set. So if you're working just at home, you'll be fine to set it once. If it's a shared computer, it's very important to go to File, Set Project every time you open your scene. So now we can have a look at the interface. At the very top left corner of the screen, we have what we call the menu set. And if we click on that, you've got some different options. And this really depends on what you're working on, whether it's modeling, rigging, animation or effects or simulations. For now, we'll leave this on modeling. Below that, we have what we call the shelf. And the shelf here, again, we have different tabs depending on what you're doing. I'll leave this on polygons for now. And then we have some basic options, some shapes and some tools. The good thing with Maya is if you hold the mouse over something, it tells you the correct technical name, so you can pick that up quite quickly. Now if we look at the middle of our screen, we have our 3D workspace and we have what's called the grid. Now here we can move around by holding Alt on the keyboard. If you hold the left button on your mouse, we can actually rotate or tumble around your grid. Hold Alt, middle click on the mouse, hold the middle button in, and we can pan around. And if you just move the scroll wheel on its own without holding Alt, we can zoom in and out. Alternatively, if you find that's jumping too much, hold Alt, hold the right button on the mouse, and then just move the mouse forwards and backwards, and you can zoom in a much finer way. So have a practice of those. It does take a bit of getting used to. And something to be aware of with 3D space, we have 3 axes, X, Y and Z. Y is always up and down. The way I'm looking at this now, Z is left to right and X is front to back. Now, I know it's that way around because I have a key in the bottom left corner of the screen. You can see here Y is up and down, Z left to right, X front to back. If I rotate my grid around, you'll see that key rotates as well. So now X is left to right, Z is front to back, and Y is up and down. Now this is what we call the perspective view, and it says persp at the bottom center of the screen. We can actually enter different views. If we press space, we enter what we call the orthographic view. And there we have, in addition to perspective, top, front, and a side view. And we can enter any of these by holding the mouse over that and then press space, and we can actually go into the top view, for example. Now, you can still zoom, you can still hold Alt, middle click and pan, but you'll find you can't rotate or tumble. If we try, so Alt, left click, it actually says in the top corner of the screen, orthographic views cannot be tumbled. You have to go into the perspective view for that. So to go back, press space again, move the mouse over perspective and press space one last time. So now we can have a look at some basic objects. Now, I won't go through the tools in this part. I'll have a look at the basic tools in part 2 of this tutorial. So for now, let's just have a look at some of these basic polygon primitives. If we have a look at a cube, if I select that, by default, it goes in the center of the grid. Now, that can be a bit frustrating because you might not want it there, you might want it somewhere else. And although we can move that with some different tools, which we'll look at in part 2, there is a way where you can actually position it on the grid exactly where you want while you create it. And to do that, go to Create at the top of the screen, Polygon Primitives, and then turn on Interactive Creation. And that will stay on now forever until you turn it off. Even if you close and reopen Maya, Interactive Creation is now on. If I now go back to my shelf and select a cube, Maya will now prompt me to actually drag on the grid any shape or size anywhere, and then it will prompt me to drag up to set the height. Okay, so that's much better than just dropping it in the center of the grid. We can delete this one in the center by selecting it and then press backspace. Select your new one and now have a look around this by holding Alt and just try rotating around and panning around to get used to that. If you press F, it will actually center it in the middle of the screen, and then when you rotate, it rotates around that. And some useful things for you to know before we move on to part 2 is if I deselect this object, if I click anywhere outside of this, you now lose some of these visible edges. If we move around, it can be quite difficult to see exactly where the edges are. So I'm going to go back to my shelf. Below that, go to Shading, and then Wireframe on Shaded. And that gives us these dark blue lines, so we can actually see exactly where the edges are, and it makes it much more efficient to really see what's going on. Now, if you want to find out some information about your object, we can select it, and we can open what we call the channel box. If you go to the very top right of the screen, there's 4 symbols up here, and the one to the far right is your channel box. Like I said earlier, hold the mouse over that and it will actually tell you what it is. So click on your channel box, and that gives us some basic information. Translate, rotate and scale, X, Y and Z on every single one. Translate corresponds to the position on the grid. 0 is the center, and then in one direction, so if we took Y, for example the Y-axis, which is up and down, up will be a positive number, down below 0 will be a negative number. That's the same for X and Z. So you can see at the moment, these are all positive numbers, but if this was over the other side of the grid, one of those will be negative, and we'll have a look at that in more detail in future tutorials. Rotate is in degrees, so 360 degrees is around once, 180 is a half turn, 90 is a quarter turn. Scale, the default is 1, and we can have a look at these again in more detail in part 2. And if we have a look below this, you've got inputs, Polycube 2. If we select Polycube 2, you get some more information. And we can actually change what we call the subdivisions of our objects. So subdivisions, what we mean by that is the number of divisions on each face. So a cube has 6 faces, and each face doesn't have any divisions going through that, it's just one face. If I select one of these, so if I choose subdivisions height, select the words, and then holding the middle button of the mouse in, I can drag left to right and I can actually change the number of divisions on my object. Again, we'll look at this in more detail later on, but just be aware of where that is. And don't get carried away. Don't put loads of divisions in thinking it looks better. It makes it much harder to work with. Keep divisions low because it's much easier to add them in than it is to remove them later on. But you can do the same for the width and the depth. If you know the exact number, you can just type that in. The next thing to look at is the attribute editor. If we go up to Windows, at the top of the screen, attribute editor, it gives us some of the same information as the channel box, but it can give us some more information as well. So have a look at these tabs along the top here. The first one generally gives you the same information as the channel box. The second one is really when we get to the rendering stage and manipulating the objects. Third tab, very similar to the channel box again, and there's a few more, so have a look at those, but we will be using this in a lot more detail in future tutorials. And you'll find on the far right of the screen, you can actually switch between your channel box and your attribute editor quite quickly. Unless you close them down. If you close them, you have to go back to your menus to reopen them. Or there's shortcuts at the top here for your channel box and your attribute editor. The last thing to look at is what we call the outliner. So if we go back to Windows, outliner is what gives us all the information and names of everything in our scene. So we have our cameras, perspective, top, front and side, and we've got our object here, pCube2. You probably want to change the name of that, so just double click and then you can change the name. You can call it anything you want. So if we modelled a table, call it tabletop, table leg, anything you like, anything appropriate. Just make sure you actually title everything as you move along. It's very easy to get carried away, and before you know it, you've got 20 or 30 or even hundreds of different objects in here, and if you don't have names, you'll never really know what they are, and you'll spend ages searching through your scene. So have a play around with this. Have a look at part 2 next, which will be the basic tools and how to actually use subdivisions to your advantage.